The practice, I believe, is still it's still being practiced, the sacred marriage, to this day in those circles. They see themselves in terms of the Nephilim.
It's very important to understand the sacred marriage because it just gives you that full picture.
Absolutely.
What if the Nephilim weren't myth at all, but the intentional offspring of a forbidden sacred marriage ritual carried out in ancient Sumer and Egypt? People, welcome to the program. So, Willie, in the antediluvian traditions outlined, how does the Gyrus Gamos function as the ritual mechanism for conceiving the Nephilim, especially through the fallen seed motive?
Yes, Levi. So the Gyrus Gamos actually refers to the sacred marriage, just Greek terminology. So the sacred marriage ritual was actually practiced from a very early period in ancient Sumer. There cannot be any doubt that this kind of ritual went back to the time before the deluge, before the Great Flood, from the earliest of times in Sumer. Now, the period when they practiced this ritual was also the seeding time. So the seed fell in the ground, and then from that, the plants grow. So they actually envisioned the spiritual dimension in exactly the same way. So in this case, they envisioned the fallen gods as fallen seed that fell in the ground. So the divine seed then of the gods, especially the earth god, but the divine seed of the earth god, in this case Enki, that fell on the ground, and from the ground was born 8, and there was eventually born 8 gods to this god. So this find expression within the framework of the sacred marriage. The sacred marriage, on the one hand, it had to do with the ensuring the fertility of the land, but on another level, it actually concerned the gods, the fallen seed, the divine seed. Now, the Anunnaki is the terminology in ancient Sumer used for the gods. It refers to the seed of Nun. Nun was the prince. Originally, it referred to the supreme god An. So it was his seed, his sons. The sons of the supreme god, his seed was the fallen seed. In this case, all the gods were his seed, but in this case, it became quite often it was transferred to Enki. So it then happened to be the seed of Enki that fell on the ground, the fallen gods. But in this sacred marriage, the girl, for example, in later Uruk tradition, Ninsun, she was closely identified with Ki, the earth. So the seed that fell on the ground within the framework of the sacred marriage referred to her, and this divine seed that was born from the sacred marriage to her, to this princess, this high priestess, through those rituals. Yes.
So, Willie, can you expand on the terminology, the sacred marriage, what it entails, and why it's called the sacred marriage?
Yeah, so it was a sacred ritual. It was held once a year on the new year. It was the seeding season, as I've mentioned. So it was a very important part. It was actually, I would say, within the earliest of tradition, within the Dumuzi cult in ancient Sumer, that was sort of the high point in the rituals of that period. Yeah, it was the most important ritual.
Yeah, and it's not isolated to Sumeria as well. You find it in different cultures as well.
Yeah, it's from there. It's spread throughout the world. We find it in Egypt, ancient Egypt. We later on find it in the Mediterranean region. We find it all over the ancient world. There's no doubt about it. It's spread all over the ancient world. And it always, even later on in the Mediterranean region, in the form, it was closely linked to the Eleusinian cult. We still have this undertone of gods or diamonds that's being reborn through these culture, through these rituals. Yes.
Yeah. Wonderful, thank you. What is the Illudemon or daemon as the invisible man, and how does this invisible yet potent divine intermediary embody the Euroscamus to breach the celestial council of the sons of God with early unions?
Yeah, so the Illudemon is actually very interesting because he is mentioned with regard to Gilgamesh in the Sumerian king list. In the Sumerian king list, that we read that the Illudemon he was fathered by the Illudemon, which is at the same time said to be an high priest, and most likely in reference to Lugalbanda, which is in a different tradition said to have been his father. So what we find then is that in this tradition, the Illudemon is the father. Now, one could ask of Gilgamesh, which clearly is here an archetype of the Nephilim. So one could ask, but isn't it the gods then that actually the sons of God, the seed of the gods, that was reborn in the form of the Nephilim? But this is exactly the point, because in ancient Sumer, what we find is that the Anuna or Anunnaki, these gods, were actually also the fallen ones associated with daimons or spirits residing in burial mounds. We, for example, read in the epic, The Death of Gilgamesh, we read about the Anuna, or that's the Anunnaki of the Holy Mount, the burial mount, the Nungals, the Igigi of the Holy Mount. Now, the Igigi were just a subgroup among the Anuna. So here we find that the gods, once they become fallen beings, they were actually identified as daimons. So the daimons were very much gods, but it was the fallen gods that were referred to in this way. We find exactly the same in the Bible, in biblical tradition. In this case, for example, in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 17, we find that the Elohim, which is actually a general term that's throughout the Bible from time to time used in reference to the gods, is here very closely linked with the daimons, which in the biblical tradition is called Shedim. It corresponds with the Mesopotamian tradition where these daimons were called Shedu. So we read, they sacrificed to demons, the Shedim, not God. The gods, that's the Elohim, they did not know. So here we find that the gods, the Elohim, is closely linked with the Shedim. So this is what is of importance in the situation. In this case, is that and I must say, in this case, the Shedim, then we also find a very interesting passage in the book of Isaiah, where the daimons are actually identified. These daimons are then identified as Rephaim. Now we know that the Rephaim, is in the biblical tradition are very closely linked with the Nephilim. So let me read Isaiah chapter 14, verse 9. Sheol, that's the netherworld, beneath is eager to meet you upon your arrival. It stirs the spirits of the dead. Now, spirits of the dead, in this case, the Hebrew word is the Rephaim. It refers to the Rephaim, but it's translated as the spirits or the daimons, the spirits of the dead. So the daimons are here in this passage called, it's actually the Rephaim that's being translated in this way. All the rulers of the earth. So it's the rulers of the earth, their daimons, and this is another fascinating aspect which we also find, for example, in Greek and extra-biblical Jewish tradition, that the daimons are all linked to the early rulers of that age, especially in Greek tradition with Hesiod referring to the earliest kings, the guardian spirits, as these daimons that was venerated in Greek tradition. So what we find here is the Nephilim is explicit because it's so intimately connected with the Rephaim, is here explicitly described in terms of being daimons, and this corresponds with the Shedim as daimons, And that's just another name for the diamonds more generally. And these then actually were fallen gods. So when we find in the Sumerian king list that the Ilu diamond is described as the father of Gilgamesh, it simply means that it's these diamonds that were active in the framework of the sacred marriage, and through whom these Nephilim were then sired and born. Yes.
Yeah, it's interesting. It just makes me think of Deuteronomy 32 that speaks about nations being divided among the sons of God. And the term prince shows up in Daniel as well for spiritual rulers over regions.
Yes, yes, that's interesting.
Yeah, sort of. Yeah. So Willie, building on the celestial eagle symbolism of Itana versus the chthonic serpent realm of Enki and Ninhursag, how does the Heroes Gamos involving the Ilu diamond reflect a deeper cosmic tension or a rebellion that allows the divine seed to manifest in hybrid offspring?
Yeah, so you make reference of Itana. Itana the name means it's a very ancient Sumerian king, legendary king. His name means he that went to God, and he corresponds closely with the biblical Enoch. So within the antediluvian period, that very early period, what we find in the Itana tradition is that there was this conflict between the eagle and the serpent. And the eagle was closely linked with Itana. Itana then being the biblical Enoch, and the Semites. And over and against them was the serpent, which was associated with the Sumerians, and especially with Enki, his consort, and Ninhursag at Eridu. And also in this area, during this pre-flood period, in archaeological terms, it's called the Ubaid period. In that vicinity of Eridu, we find certain figurines of a woman breastfeeding a baby, and she has the features of a serpent. Now that corresponds with Ninhursag. Ninhursag was actually in the literature described exactly in these terms as a serpent and this breastfeeding a baby. But what we have here is a kind of shamanism that was basically a serpent shamanism. Now after the deluge,
so Willie, if you talk about sacred unions, divine human offspring, and fallen sons of God, that usually describes the serpent side of this whole strategy or conflict.
Yeah, one should not only see it in terms of the serpent. So the serpent eventually became closely linked with the female line, the female lineage, in the larger framework of the genealogies of the Nephilim. But what happened after the deluge, after the great flood, is that the Urukites, the house of Uruk, they actually borrowed quite a lot from the Semites. For example, the idea of kingship. Kingship originated among the Semites, not the Sumerians. The earliest Sumerian rulers were not kings. Kings were warriors, warrior leaders. But the Sumerians were fertility rulers. They were involved in fertility. They were priestly kind of rulers, a totally different kind of ruler. But in the post-Diluvian period, after the deluge at Uruk, which was by far the greatest city in Sumer at that time, this house of Uruk incorporated many Semitic aspects into their religion. Among other things, we find a kind of shamanism that incorporated the eagle. So whereas the eagle at first was associated with the Semites, now we find, for example, that Enki is shown with the eagle in his hand. But what this refers to is the eagle of shamanism, because he is the god of shamanism. So what we now find is a different kind of shamanism that enters the picture. And Lugalbanda, for example, in this ancient Urukite tradition, he is described as having been reborn in the nest of the Anzu eagle as a very great shaman. And remember, he's the one that's mentioned as the father of Gilgamesh. His wife in the sacred marriage rituals then were Nensun, which in the Babylonian tradition is described as the daughter of Enmerkar. Now, Enmerkar, in the same way that Etana corresponds with Enoch in biblical tradition, Enmerkar, corresponds with Nimrod in biblical tradition. And we will come back to Nimrod later on and have an in-depth discussion on that. But this means, because in the biblical tradition, we find that Nimrod is obviously closely not only linked with the Nephilim, because when we read that the Nephilim were men of renown, clearly Nimrod was one of those being referred to, because he is described as being a man of renown in that passage about him in chapter 10. Yeah. He was a great hunter. So he was a man of renown. And he's also linked to the Tower of Babel event. So the Tower of Babel events...
I can just throw in there, I mean, if you look at the Semites, they're actually a language family or a cultural group, and it includes the Akkadians, Assyrians, and, for example, the Babylonians as well.
That's right, So after... I think it most likely it was as a result of intermarriage between these groups that this kind of iconography was also included within the Sumerian tradition. And so what we find here is in the time of the house of Uruk, after the deluge, this is when we can locate the Tower of Babel events, which is again in the biblical tradition described in terms of a great rebellion. So the kind of conflict that we find in the time before the Great Flood actually continued afterwards, and especially with regard to the Tower of Babel events. And it was actually through these events that these Nephilim were born through the sacred marriage ritual. So it stood in terms of a rebellion against God. It cannot be seen in a different way.
Oh, yeah. And that brings me to another question. How does the ancient sacred marriage ritual framework illuminate the Genesis 6 narrative of the sons of God coupling with the daughters of man, if I can put it that way? And how does it reposition the Nephilim not merely as fallen ones, but as deliberate products of Eurus Gamos, echoing the Anunnaki princely seed, and as well as the August stripling in the 8-foot text?
Yeah, so this is quite fascinating, because what we've now done, we've discussed the extra-biblical tradition, the oldest strata of extra-biblical tradition that's found in Sumer. Now, when we take the Bible and the biblical tradition, reference is made to the sons of God. Now, the sons of God correspond with the seed of Nun in the ancient Sumerian tradition, the Anunnaki. The sons of the supreme God. In this case, the idea of fallen ones enter the picture. The Nephilim, that means fallen ones. So it corresponds again with the fallen seed in that ancient tradition, where the fallen seed, symbolized by seed fallen in the ground during the seeding period, referred to the divine seed that came down and was born from earth, Ki, in this case, Nensun, which was identified with the goddess of the earth, Ki. An and Ki were then paired in the Uruk tradition, the heaven and earth, and the seed that fell on the earth then were reborn. These gods were born on earth, the earthly or the fallen diamonds or fallen gods. So this is the background here.
Yeah, in Sumerian tradition, I mean, the kings were framed as the carriers of that divine essence, or the seed of the gods.
Yeah, exactly. So, and what we find in the biblical tradition in Genesis 6, it's not clearly stated how these sons of God actually fathered these Nephilim. It's mentioned that it was with the human maidens, but it's not said how it happened. Now, once we have this ancient background, we understand that it happened through the sacred marriage ritual. And Gilgamesh, being the best example in the ancient world of a Nephilim, is also described as a giant. and he's born from the sacred marriage ritual, and his father is described as this Lilo diamond. So now we understand, we've got a better picture. So it was these diamonds that were reborn through the sacred marriage ritual, and it was during that's the background and the context for what we read in Genesis 6. Now, in the ancient Egyptian tradition, we've also discussed the Edfu tradition quite a few times on this program. And in the Edfu tradition, we have the same situation. We have the time before the deluge. It's actually in the Edfu tradition is very clearly distinguished the time before and after the flood. So the original civilization where these gods were incarnated on earth, that civilization was destroyed by the flood. And then afterwards, the certain shamans went back to that original homeland of the gods, as it's called in the Edfu text. And their purpose was to reincarnate the gods that lived before the deluge again on earth. And the rituals were very primitive, certain shamanistic rituals and so forth. But once we combine this tradition with the Sumerian tradition, we understand that it was through the sacred marriage rituals that on particular time of the year, and also during a particular period when the celestial skies was in a certain arrangement. That was at the time when Tuban was the polar star, and they believed, for example, in the celestial skies, Pleiades, the 7 stars of the Pleiades, which they believed was reborn from Ki, from Ninsun, from the ground, and became the companions of Lugalbanda. We read that, or what we find in the celestial skies is that because of the precession of the equinoxes, the position that these stars had on the horizon actually shifted slightly. It moved from below the equator to above the equator. That's the line, the ground level. So they were born above ground. That's when the seed grew and appeared upon earth. So that was exactly when these Anunnaki were reborn on earth. So they, in their rituals, they had a very particular way and a timing for these rituals, which is of great importance. And we associate that with the celestial code. They had an understanding of this larger picture, this writing in the celestial skies, according to which they celebrated this sacred marriage, and when these gods were then born on earth. Yeah.
Willie, just a little caveat. If you look at today, do we still see some embers of the sacred marriage surviving? Do you have any thoughts around that?
Yeah, I believe in these circles and in these certain secret societies, it's definitely still the case that they practice it. For example, the listeners that are familiar with the Da Vinci Code, for example, will probably remember that kind of scenes in the book. So
yes.
That's the practice, I believe, is still it's still being practiced, the sacred marriage to this day in those circles. Yes, certain circles that themselves, they see themselves in terms of the Nephilim bloodlines. Yes.
It's very important to understand the sacred marriage because it just gives you that full picture.
Absolutely.
Of what happens with the Nephilim and understanding some of these traditions better. So, Willie, given the extremely archaic, pre-phonetic, oral, bardic layer of these traditions, how does interpreting the fallen angels' unions as rooted in Eros Gamos and the Ilu Daemon help reconcile Sumerian extra-biblical material with later apocalyptic Watcher traditions?
So in the book of Enoch, we, for example, find interestingly that the fallen angels, now called the Watchers, that their union with these human maidens, it's actually described in terms of marriage, that they actually took them as wives. And this is quite interesting because this links up with this ancient Sumerian tradition of the sacred marriage. Now, this is not in the Bible. It's not in Genesis 6. Genesis 6 doesn't say that they were married. So this idea of marriage actually is consistent with this ancient sacred marriage ritual. What we also find in the book of Enoch is that it was when these angels rebelled against God that they did this. Again, this is closely linked with what we find, for example, in ancient Sumer, especially in the time after the deluge, when these things happened. These Nephilim were born during the events of the Tower of Babel, which stands exactly within the framework of this rebellion against God, and should be understood in those terms. So now we have a much better understanding of how these traditions evolved and how it came about and was later on, especially in the book of Enoch, which borrows a lot from Mesopotamian tradition. Remember, the Jews were taken in exile in Babylon, and that was where they discovered these traditions. They put two and two together. They understood that it's linked to the biblical tradition of the Nephilim, and they borrowed a lot from that side, which is not wrong, because we've already seen that these are actually very old Nephilim traditions going back to Sumer, and that was handed down among the Babylonians. Yes.
Yeah. Perfect. So this was really, I would say, complex and very, very interesting with some of these terminologies, I believe, new to some of the viewers. But what we'll do is we'll revisit some of these concepts later on again. And just for some clarity, if you haven't watched the previous episodes, just go back and take a peek. It's definitely very, very worth your while. So, Willie, thank you for reframing the Nephilim as the product of a deliberate sacred union, a Eros Gamos mediated by the Illudaimon, the invisible bridge between fallen angels and human women. And just to add, it's not just a myth, but a memory echoing through the ancient world.
Absolutely.
Anything else you would like to add?
No, yeah. I think it's a fascinating theme, and by also studying the ancient Sumerian traditions, we get a much better picture. Picture of the Nephilim is enriched in so many different ways, and we understand what we read in the Bible so much better. So it throws a lot of light, because the Bible doesn't say a lot. Genesis 6 verse 4, it's just about one sentence or so. It's very little information, but we do have the ancient original traditions from which the biblical tradition originated.
Yeah. So I do have a final question for the viewers. Could the sons of God's union with the daughters of men in Genesis 6 actually stem from this ancient Eros Gamos facilitated by the Illudaimon? And does this sacred marriage view change how you see the Nephilim? Please share your thoughts. And if you have any other questions, post it. We would love to engage you guys.
Yes, it will be wonderful to hear from the community. You read the comments.
There you go. Thank you very much.